Welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast, proudly presented by Venture Hunting and Outdoors. If you're like us and passionate about hunting, spearfishing, and many other outdoor-related pursuits, with an eagerness to fast-track your learning, then this podcast is perfect for you. G'day legends, and welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast. Today we're doing a bit of a film breakdown, which I'm really excited about. We're going to be revisiting one of my more successful adventures and to give you guys a bit of a background into that very specific hunt. So this particular adventure was a hunt for water buffalo and feral pigs in Australia's Northern Territory. A film that we suitably called The Honey Hole after finding a really cool little hotspot in a vast sort of landscape. This adventure took place during the winter months, which happens to be what we call the dry season here in the subtropics in Australia. Generally, the summers and like the monsoonal rains fill the floodplains and all the water sources across the sort of top end landscape over the summer months, as I said. And then this excessive rain and just the water characterise the wet season, what we often term the wet season, just because it's so much rain sort of hits the ground at one period of time. As the year then ticks along and the seasons change, the landscape begins to sort of dry up and much of that water begins to evaporate. It'll often go 6 to 9 months without any rain between sort of, let's say, March almost until December again the following year. So these smaller little limited pools of water really do concentrate animals, and this offers some unreal hunting opportunities, which hopefully you'll sort of appreciate within this film. The NT or top end in general is quite famous for its abundance of, Australian native wildlife, such as the birds, mammals and reptiles, including crocodiles. And then as hunters, we obviously put quite a bit of focus and emphasis on some of the introduced feral animals and the hunting opportunities that are there. Which include animals such as water buffalo, wild pigs. There are donkeys, camels, banteng, all these different species, which is pretty remarkable. This hunt in particular focuses mainly on water buffalo and wild or feral pigs. We'll also touch on some FAQs, which have been sent in by you guys, our valued listeners. So if you guys have a question, please email us at info@twinelements.com.au. with the subject line FAQ, and either James or myself will get to answering those for you. If you'd prefer to send us a question via social media, we also appreciate those. So please simply just send us a DM via Instagram or something like that to either Twin Elements, Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors or James Doumtsis Outdoors, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Without further ado, we'll jump into the podcast.
Kyoga Broadheads. Where do I begin? Ayden and I have just absolutely taken to and love these broadheads. He's shooting the 150 grain Zots while I'm shooting the 150 grain pilot cuts with bleeders. There was no other head that I was going to run in Montana on my limited entry hunt than the pilot cut. And I was so happy when I took down the bull of a lifetime. We've teamed up with Kyoga to get 10% off your next order by using the code TWIN10 at checkout. That is TWIN 10 the number at checkout to get 10% off your next order.
Alrighty, so I'm actually pretty excited about this podcast. You probably wouldn't have heard my voice for about a month now, as James was pretty heavy doing the USA sort of tag and application podcast with our good friend Austin Atkinson from the US. I have been busy the last month or so actually being back in the Northern Territory. For those who've been following the podcast and sort of what James and I have been doing over the last sort of 6 months or so, I moved from where I was living in the Northern Territory back to Australia's East Coast and have been sort of trying to set up a bit of a life here in sort of Queensland. So it was really good to go back and do a bit of contract work as a veterinarian just for a month, doing something that obviously as an adult we need to pay the bills, but it was also just really good to get back, see familiar friends and faces and things like that. But also just the challenge of, quite hard, difficult work. And for those of you that have sort of followed me along would have heard some of the stories that I've been able to do and experience and things that I've seen and done over in the Northern Territory. Because the background is that I worked in the NT for 2 years as a full-time veterinarian. To be honest, it was one of the best parts of my life. After graduating uni and James Cook University in North Queensland, made the trip out to the Northern Territory and very quickly sort of set up a life over there. To be honest, I basically moved over there for the opportunity to do a bit more hunting and fishing and just sort of be in a different landscape. And unfortunately, as I quickly found out, there was probably less time to hunt than I had initially anticipated, just with the demands of the job and being a vet in such a rural landscape where there's quite a few people scattered over a massive sort of landscape. I quickly found out that there were two different types of sort of work that fell under the veterinary job. So for me, over the wet season, it was very much small animals, so your dogs, cats, and then a lot of horse work. For the people that lived in the surrounding area would bring them in just because a lot of the time they were landlocked and they'd sort of get to the things like doing routine dentals on their horses and just general like health examinations and these sort of things. As well as, while it was wet and people were in town, they'd have their dogs vaccinated and all these sorts of things. Similarly to the hunting opportunities, as the ground sort of dried up and you could get out to places and, all these remote sort of parcels and properties began to dry up and access was a bit better, the cattle work sort of started to creep in, and that would happen, as I said earlier, in the dry season. And for months of a year, I would literally just be living out of my car, driving from station to station preg testing, which is the act of basically up in the Northern Territory, we do it manually. So with lube, we basically go and place our hand in the cow and determine its gestation months of how many months pregnant it is. And that can vary from 1 to 9 months pregnant, similar to humans, or empty. So if we decide that they don't have a calf in there, we call them empty, or not detectably pregnant. And going about this process, there was times where I'd do 1,000 animals in a day, or 1,000 cows, drive to the next property, and you can understand that that gets pretty demanding when you're doing that for months at a time, both physically and mentally. So I unfortunately thought, by doing this and driving to many properties and all these types of things, I'd get a ridiculous amount of access to hunt on these properties. But it proved harder to get access than I first anticipated, mainly because a lot of the work that I did was actually sort of south of Katherine in the Northern Territory, where I was based mainly at the clinic. So a lot of the work that I did was south and sort of west, more towards WA, where it got quite arid and dry. And there were more sort of species like dingoes, donkeys, the odd feral pig, and camels, rather than, the buffalo, the banteng, and the feral pigs that I was sort of more interested in and were probably more accessible. The other thing I realised very quickly is that in the Northern Territory, there's a monetary value on a lot of these resources. A lot of the properties will either capture and export the water buffalo. So they'll use, cars and bikes and helicopters and all these sorts of things and catch the buffalo, tip their horns, take them through a bit of a husbandry procedure, sometimes even fatten them up in yards and then export them to international countries for meat and things like that. Very much the same as like a domestic cow. Or they would have like hunting safaris on there, and then through hunting safaris they'd obviously have trophy fees and people that were turning this wild resource into a profit or a market. So me coming along and being able to shoot the odd buffalo sort of wasn't as feasible or attractive as these offers where they had money coming in. So I unfortunately probably did a little bit less hunting, but that's where this hunt in particular comes in, is that after doing a few months of cattle work, I hadn't really seen friends, family for a little while, and I basically just said to James, like, hey, I'm going to line up a couple of days where we can go and hit this block that I've got access to. I've never been there. I haven't had the time. I've done a lot of e-scouting and things like that in preparation for when I do finally go. All that I need to do is, get your confirmation to say that, yep, you'll come over and we'll do this adventure together. And I'll line up with the property owner that, we can basically go out and have access to where he thinks, there might be a buffalo or a few pet feral pigs roaming around. And that basically leads us into when James arrives, and it was less than ideal, where I'd finished, again, a heap of work. Probably wasn't shooting my bow as much as I should have, just because I was doing these massive days of, wake up at 4 a.m., go have breakfast, drive to the cattle yards, preg test 1,000 head of cows, finish that job, and either get back in the dark just to sort of, go do life admin and do it again the next day, or drive a couple hundred Ks to the next property and just keep doing that and that on repeat essentially. So again, things were sort of getting in the way, but we did manage to get James into the Northern Territory, and he flew into Darwin at around 1 a.m. After a few flight delays and things. So he had the midnight flame, the red eye that we call them here in Australia. After that, picked him up, gave him a big hug because I hadn't seen him in quite a while, and pretty quickly the hunt was set into motion. From there, we drove to the property, which was a couple of hours away, in between Darwin and Catherine. And we actually grabbed our swags and just slept on the side of the road, basically because we didn't want to put the property owner out. He said that we could meet him the next morning at around 6 a.m. So we basically camped on the side of the road, travelled into the property and got there at 6 a.m. so that he could give us a bit of a mud map and show us where we'd be camping and all that type of stuff. So we were very eager, a little bit sleep deprived, but that's sort of what paints the picture as to how the hunt sort of starts. From there, we actually had a couple of days up our sleeve, but as you'll hear, everything sort of happens in the first day, which is definitely not how most hunts go, but it was just the combination of a little bit of probably luck, a little bit of hard work, and definitely a lot of prior preparation and like pre-scouting and that type of stuff, which is probably the main theme of this trip is just even when you can't be hunting and putting boots to the ground, always trying to just maximize for the opportunity that when you can, you're prepared and ready. And that's what we did. So we basically got into camp, chucked our swags on the ground, had like a little Yeti with some cold food and all that type of stuff and ice, had a few shots of the bows, got all the camera gear ready and lined up, and then headed out from there. I have personally been using Hoyt bows for over 20 years now, building the most innovative and technological advanced gear. Their carbon bows are the lightest, leanest, and ultra compact on the market. Quite frankly, I treat mine like hell. Throwing it around, banging it on rocks and scrub, time and time again, it has performed when I've needed it the most. Get serious, get Hoyt. So where we camped, we try to have a bit of strategy because we were going to be camping remotely and just swagging it. We wanted to be somewhat close to water, but with the threat of crocodiles and things like that in the Northern Territory, we didn't want to be too close to water. So we found this sort of dry creek or river and camped there, and there were a few water holes, but you could actually see like into them and could tell that there were no crocodiles where we sort of were. There were a few little freshies, but no saltwater crocodiles, which are the main ones that we're worried about. From there, we actually decided that we're pretty much in the heart of where we wanted to be. And fortunately, where I had done a bit of pre-scouting, because some of these properties are thousands, if not millions of acres in size, I'd sort of used this mapping software, which a lot of you, if you've been following along the podcast, would have known or heard about through James and I. It's called GPS Kit. It's a app that's on the Apple Store on your phone. You can download it for, I think it's around $15, and it gives you access to offline downloadable maps, as well as, you can chuck drop pins on there, you can do waypoints, you can do tracks, all these different sort of features, which really help you, lock down and find out and be able to, nut down exactly where you are on the property, exactly where you've been, exactly where you want to go, all these sorts of things, and really make it quite a good resource to getting familiar with quite large parcels of property. And so where we were hunting was pretty remote. Once we'd got to the property and left the house and all that type of stuff, we had no actual phone service. We did have UHF, so we could get in touch in the case of emergency. We also had Garmin inReaches, all these sort of things. But for our general everyday purposes, we were relying on offline maps to sort of know exactly where we were and where we were heading, and then try and use our knowledge to, check out these likely sources. And so what our strategy is, especially with this new property, is I'd sort of gone and marked in all these big rivers and creeks and things. From there, gone, okay, during the wet season, those rivers and creeks are gonna flood, and then when they flood, water is going to be abundant in the closer areas to those, and then as you get further out, they'll dry up a bit quicker. So our strategy going into what is now the dry season was to obviously find these rivers and creeks, confirm that they had water in them, and then look for like green pockets and any little isolated water holes. In some instances on these e-scouting and these maps, the satellite imagery is so good that you can actually see game trails and specific, like, I guess, animal trails between water holes or going from a river to what looks like a bit of a swamp and things like that. And these buffalo, boars, whatever the animal is, domestic cattle even, will routinely use these game trails so prominently that they actually etch into the ground and you can see them through e-scouting. So again, that was our strategy. The next thing is, like, obviously for James and I, we got there and it was sort of early morning by this stage, was to just put boots on the ground and go and check out as much of this country as possible. So driving in that morning with the property, we saw a few buffalo. We had a few, I guess, hot leads as to where we could go back and look for everything. Nothing that we saw via the car driving in on this little remote, cattle track sort of thing was worth a look. They were all just cows and calves, and we were, to be honest, looking for like a nice mature bull. So yeah, we'd sort of driven past them, but made a mental note and marked, a few nice gullies, a few good water holes that we could actually see from the road. And it just further confirmed for us that, the animals were going to be around water as it's a dry season, and that's what they're relying on, is that water and green feed, potentially even places that had recently burnt, and that green pick comes back up really nice and fresh and lush for them to feed on. So being able to identify that, it's the dry season, animals are going to be doing a little bit poorer than when it's, the wet season and there's food and water absolutely abundant and available to them wherever they are. In these sort of times when it is dry, the animals are forced to sort of come in and be more focused on certain resources. So that sort of brings us into, I guess, when walking these creeks and things like that, immediately we started noticing wildlife, and often the way in the Northern Territory, water is life. And that was very much the case with these creeks, and they were just teeming with bird life, whether it was small little, fantails and willy wagtails and these sort of things that were just catching insects along the edge of the river, or if it was that next step up and you had all these different water birds, whether it was, things like herons and darters and cormorants and all these things sort of lining the banks on all the dead and dying hollow logs and things like that, and branches that had fallen into the river. There were spoonbills, all different types of birds, which was absolutely amazing to just watch. One of the other things is, I think, the amount of predatory birds and raptors and kites and these sort of hawks and things like that we see in the Australia's Northern Territory are second to none. And then that steps it up as well when you shift from birds to other species of Australian native wildlife. Just the amount of crocodiles we're seeing, particularly freshwater crocodiles, which are lesser of a concern for us. But yeah, in all these small little shallow creeks, a lot of them, to be honest, were quite clear, just because the water was still flowing in parts. But it was pretty cool to just, be sharing the landscape with crocodiles, not feel particularly threatened by them as we moved along these creek banks and things. But obviously when you see, freshwater crocodiles, the risk that a saltwater crocodile is around is definitely playing on the back of your mind, which is something we'll touch on shortly as we sort of keep going on here. But we eventually actually found some buffalo, and again, just walking with the wind in our face, trying to cover as much country as possible, we'd use these like internetworks of creeks and little billabongs, and you'd follow a creek or a finger off the creek that looked really green and lush, and that would lead you to like a good little billabong or a water hole that had been cut off from the main supply of the creek. And then as this sort of dried up, it created like refuge for, there were feral cattle, pigs. We started finding pigs, buffalo, all different species of animals that were sort of living off the main creek and living on these little secluded patches of water and feed. So that quickly cemented to us that, okay, maybe to find a big mature bull, we have to actually go a bit further from the big rivers and the big creeks and actually branch out and try and find these last little, I guess, what we call honey holes, which is the furthest spot away from any road or any track or any human sort of intervention, that still has everything they need in terms of shelter, food, and water. So that was our biggest thing. And basically trying to find where the animals were congregating in these little spots became our mission for the rest of the day. So that sort of brings us to what James and I called the honey hole. Again, after checking probably 10 to 20 different water sources, often having quite a few different encounters with buffalo and wild pigs and things, which you'll see in the film. If you haven't already, it is available on our YouTube channel. It's called The Honey Hole. It's a pretty fast-paced little film. Again, because that was sort of the theme of the trip. James and I were there. We had a very short period of time to sort of get in, get it done, experience this adventure before, ultimately I had to go back to work and James had to fly out. So we were just trying to use this as a bit of a scouting trip for later in the year when we'd eventually come back and try and do some more hunts with a bit more time. But again, yeah, very fast-paced sort of hunt. There's a lot of wildlife footage in there. As I said, we were seeing wildlife every turn of every creek or every waterhole that we went and visited. But we'd eventually got to the point where, we'd passed up quite a few cows and calves, quite a few young pigs. The property owner said he wasn't really interested in us shooting just absolutely everything. They get quite a few hunters going through there. So he was more keen on us shooting, a trophy bull or a couple of like more mature feral pigs, should they present themselves. So, and again, we were happy to respect that. So we actually probably just after lunchtime had got to the point where we were checking the offline maps and we'd ticked off a lot of the little drop pins that I'd put in previously when I did have service. And fortunately, through seeing sort of where the animals were, we kept like broadening the search. And I said to James, I reckon that should be a good little spot. And basically pointed to this little green thicket on the map. And you couldn't actually see any water within the green thicket. But just because it was so green and so, I guess, contrasting to the surrounding area, which was very dry, open, sort of, like red earth basically, and open woodlands. This little spot that was around 6 kilometers away in a straight line from where we currently were just after lunchtime, we basically just said in our heads, like, all right, the wind's going this way. If we do a big loop around, we'll get to it and we should be able to hunt it for the afternoon. Let's just, put in a good steady sort of walk. Obviously not spooking anything because, there could be a big buffalo bull just in the middle of nowhere or a big boar bedded under a tree somewhere. So we still want to hunt our way to it, but let's, walk with the intention of getting there with a bit of time in the afternoon to sort of go for a hunt because we were able to identify that this looks like something that we want to be hunting based on sort of the experience and the knowledge that we'd got that morning hunting other sort of water sources. And I'm glad we definitely did that. And again, it just comes back to experience in being able to say, hey, we're seeing cows and calves. If a bull was here, we should have seen a bull. Maybe they're off doing their own thing, or maybe they're a bit further away because this place does get a little bit of pressure. And just by being able to sort of, come to that conclusion and then commit to a bit of a plan, I think proved to be what was really essential in us actually having success on this trip. And immediately, as we sort of got closer to this, what we termed the honey hole, so within a few kilometers, we started finding really good game trails, a lot more like signs. So fresh wallow marks on trees, just matted hair from pigs and buffalo on these trees, a lot of fresh mud, a lot of feces, even patches of urine that you could like literally smell and go, yep, this is still wet. Something's come through this game trail pretty recently. And also, I think being in just after lunchtime, going into the early afternoon, it was sort of prime time for animals to start getting on their feet and wanting to cool off and stuff like that as well. So we immediately started seeing more feral pigs, more buffalo on these green edges. And what it unfolded as we got closer to this sort of big thicket of dense paperbarks, which is what that green was. So the green from above, like using satellite images, was basically a really tight conformation, I guess, of paperbark trees, which obviously like gave a lot of shade and moisture, and probably as everything else was starting to dry up, just afforded that there were a lot more small little water holes and patches of water in under that paperbarks, which then, if there's water, obviously gives, the opportunity for grass and vegetation and this type of stuff and feed to arise. So that's why the animals were there. And we basically hit this oasis as such at prime time. Basically, we got there and immediately were greeted by a mob of probably 10 buffalo. And as these buffalo were feeding on this little water hole, some of them were actually swimming in there, which was really cool. Just to see these water buffalo like submerged in the water, pulling out reeds and things like that with their horns. It was really cool to watch. And then in the background of that, back on the bank, like out of the water, you could see feral pigs, rooting up the edges and stuff like that. So it was pretty clear that we'd found this little honey hole. And our anticipation for what was to come that afternoon actually really, really heightened. And both James and I sort of gave each other a look as to like, yeah, I'm glad we did that bit of a walk. It was, as I said, it was about 6 Ks away in a straight line. So by the time we got there, we'd probably put another 10 Ks underfoot, amassing, 20 to 30 Ks for the day. But it was definitely worth it, as we'll get to here in a moment.
Whether you're making your way up a scree cliff or hiking a distant trail, you want to be confident in the boots that you wear. And for Ayden and I, that means lower. We've been running the Lower Ranger GTX3s for over 5 years now, and we've never even had a blister. We've teamed up with the Lower team to extend their generosity to you to get you a unique 10% off code by using the code TWINELEMENTS10 at checkout to get 10% off your next order. We know you're going to love them.
So we had seen a few younger bulls along our travels for that morning. Some younger bulls were with the cows. Others were just parked up sort of randomly, in the drier country, just seeking a bit of shade and refuge. None of them really sparked our interest. As we said, we weren't there to just sort of shoot anything. I didn't need meat at the time. So it was more of just a trophy hunt, looking for a nice mature water buffalo bull. And as we sort of edged our way along this big, long lagoon leading into that big paperbark thicket that we were hunting, we were actually on a mob of pigs. And I think we had one pig like 5 meters away. And James had sort of indicated to me he was just videoing a couple of the younger pigs and stuff like that. And we were just enjoying our time, hoping that, something would materialize as we seemed to be in the right spot. James sort of like pointed over to our right, and on the other side of the lagoon that we were hunting, fully covered in mud and water, like this water buffalo had obviously just wallowed. Immediately his body size was just massive, like a really big, solid, mature bull. It actually made his horns probably look a little bit smaller than how big they were, just because his body size was so impressive, and he was obviously doing well living in this tight little secluded sort of paperbark swamp. But also just the colour variance. So a lot of the cows seem to be a little bit lighter and sort of more of a grey colour. And particularly during the dry season when there is less feed available, they've often had calves and weaners sucking a lot of the milk off them. They do lose body condition, so they become a lot more like ribby, a lot lighter in colour, a lot more of this grey colour, as I've sort of said. So even from a distance, when you're like looking at a mob of buffalo, a young, fat, bull will stand out as being dark and sort of fat compared to the cows. Like unless they've really, really been rutting and mating and stuff like that, they don't lose as much condition as the cows that have, trying to suckle and provide for or lactate for these calves. So that's just one thing to sort of look out for when hunting and trying to assess, trophy potential and stuff, is that even a big cow can have quite big horns, but then from a distance being able to like look at the thickness of those horns, the body condition of that animal, the color, as general guidelines can help. So very quickly we identified that this was a mature bull, and that, based on what we'd seen for the day, we hadn't actually seen another mature bull. He very quickly got our attention. Where the, I guess, issue is that James and I were on one side of a lagoon, and on the other side is where this bull was, and he was feeding sort of away from us, sort of flirting with getting our wind. So very quickly we did a big loop out on our side and then try to run back probably another 400 or 500 meters along this lagoon, which wasn't super wide, but it was very long. And we kept checking maps, and we knew where we'd just come from, the head of the lagoon was probably still a K behind us. So our thought was, we can do a big loop and run all the way back around, or we can just run 300 to 400, 500 meters and then cut across the lagoon and be able to hunt him, hopefully while still keeping eyes on him, just because we were peering into that really thick paperbark swamp, and we knew that if he took like 20 steps off the edge, it was just so thick that we'd probably never see him again. So that was sort of the risk in our mind. And to be honest, the whole rest of the hunt from here, I wouldn't advise anyone else to make the same decisions that we did. To be honest, it was pretty naive and negligent on our behalf. But James and I elected to cross this waterway in the Northern Territory, which is pretty stupid, to be honest. Again, this lagoon, we had seen feral pigs in there, which had probably given us a false sense of security that if there were feral pigs in there, that there wouldn't be a saltwater croc in there, almost giving them, James and I giving these feral pigs a bit of a sense that, they wouldn't be in the water if there was a saltwater croc living in there, which proved to be wrong. So again, we took I wouldn't even say calculated risk assessment sort of thing. We basically risked it and crossed this water source probably around 50 meters to 70 meters wide. The deepest we got in terms of depth when crossing it was probably around mid-thigh height, definitely around past our knees in height. And the only thing that I remember going through my mind as to why we crossed it was the water was pretty much crystal clear. There was a lot of rushes and reeds, and I think these act as a bit of a filter. And it wasn't kind of like a lagoon where, the animals were wallowing in there, crapping in there, domestic cattle going through, buffalo and everything, just really muddying it up. It was really quite clear. And the other reason where we crossed where we were was that there was a bit of a game trail that had pushed the reeds down very clearly and succinctly, so that I figured we were able to get through it pretty quickly. And because the reeds were all pushed down, you could actually see the bottom pretty clearly. And again, this all sounds super dodgy, and listening back and talking about it now, it just makes me feel a bit yuck and stupid, to be honest, because it was super, super risky. And I think we knew it at the time. In the video, if you go and watch the honey hole on YouTube, I kind of look back at James just before we cross this water source, almost as if to say, are we really doing this? I give him this look to say, yeah, what are we sort of doing? And I watch the video and I kind of just want to punch myself a little bit, because I look in the video as if to say, are we doing this? And I give this little smirk, shit, I guess we are. And then, anyway, without much sort of further thought, continue to just go across the other side. And fortunately for James and I, everything went smoothly. There wasn't a crocodile sitting there waiting on this little game trail, and we get to the other side and the bow hunt continues. So I guess, yeah, it is just worth noting that this was a stupid decision in hindsight. At the time, I think we knew we were doing the wrong thing. If we had to take our time over again, we would have just gone and done the big loop fully around. At the time, we didn't know if on the other side of the water course there was water and stuff that we wouldn't have been able to get around anyway. So I think that's why in the end we sort of crossed where we did, because we just took a bit of a calculated risk and thought that was going to be the best spot for us to cross. And we never advocate for any pig, animal, water buffalo, bull, even if it's over 100 points to be worth, human life or anything like that. So always obviously act responsibly and respectfully and with safety at the foremost, I guess, would be my message from this sort of podcast. But in this instance, James and I did get to the other side, and I guess the hunt was sort of on from there. Immediately we'd cut the distance by getting on his side to within probably about 100, 150 meters by the time we'd done that wide arc. So I actually chucked an arrow on the string and slowly started sort of walking out and making our way back towards this buffalo where he was feeding towards us, as from what we could assume. And as we sort of moved in towards where we'd last seen him, we couldn't see him at this point just because the paper barks and everything was so thick, and there was a lot of rushes and reeds and just good grass cover, which is probably why he was feeding there. We couldn't actually see him, but we could hear him. And once we started hearing his horns, knocking these paper barks down and just the sheer size of him moving through the scrub, we were able to get a bit better of a pinpoint location as to where he was. From there, we were basically just constantly checking the breeze because, again, based on being on this water course, the breeze was a bit finicky, and being in the paper barks, the wind wasn't able to sort of penetrate it and keep it really consistent. So it would sort of like stop, become breathless or like no wind, and then the wind would have potential to swirl. So we were just a little bit nervous and cautious of that. But basically, we tried to get as close as we could without being too noisy. Obviously, with two of us, me hunting and James filming, moving in on this buffalo, we were trying to get as close as we could and then sort of more or less pick the path that he was working on. So he was feeding towards us. We let him do most of the moving. And over about a 10 to 15 minute sort of duration, I guess this bull, as you'll be able to see in the footage quite clearly, he ends up walking in, and we'd picked the perfect tree where we had enough cover. And basically he was coming in on this game trail that split either left or right of our position. And he comes in sort of front on towards the left, I guess. And he sort of stumbles into about 12 yards. Never knew we were there. He actually had his head down the whole time, just sort of feeding. And yeah, as he sort of walks through, I picked a bit of a window, and I was just a bit worried that if I didn't shoot him at that point, he was just going to keep coming in front on. And then, he might have got a little bit western, shooting him at less than 10 yards and having him coming in front on and potentially picking us up might have been a bit more dangerous than shooting him slightly broadside, quartering on at 12 yards. So I drew back, let him take a few steps sort of to get more and more broadside, and picked my gap through some light leaves and shrub and stuff like that. And just the sheer size of him, knew that where I was going to hit him was right through double lungs. And it was pretty cool to see that arrow just zip straight through him, through his vitals. It happened for like a split second, but I swear he like looked up and looked towards James and I. And in the footage, you'll be able to see, if you look really clearly, out of his right-hand side where the arrow's sort of gone through initially on the left, you can see the Kyoga Broadhead, the Zot, poking out the other side. And that arrow travelled through him, and then we pretty much only just held in by the Fletchers on the other side. So we had really great penetration from that broadhead. Again, they're super easy to sharpen, a great, really durable two-blade broadhead. So I think that made the difference on this hunt. And again, with big game such as buffalo, these two blades can have sort of limited blood trails, I guess, just because that skin's so thick, and when it closes up, after the two blade sort of has gone through, because that hole or that cut has less, I guess, diameter, it is easier for it to shut up. But because I knew that I'd punched him through both lungs, I knew that he was, obviously going off on a death march. So we heard him crash off in a bit of a wide arc. He started knocking down trees, as buffalo do when they move anywhere, basically. They're just such big, formidable creatures. But the benefit was that we remained still and quiet, and we heard him go down, I don't know, probably 60 meters away, if that, in a bit of an arc. And yeah, from there we gave him, I don't know, probably 10 to 20 minutes, just because, we were pretty worked up. We'd shot this really nice bull at like 10 to 12 yards, watched the arrow zip through him, heard him go down. So we weren't really in a rush. We were just talking about how exciting it was to have that all play out in front of us. And we basically from there resumed the blood trail. And again, I'd heard him sort of crash off to our right and do this big arc. And then what I heard was him go down, evidently, based on my suspicions. And then obviously being able to follow the blood trail and find exactly where he was afterwards. But we, being such a big animal, wanted to know exactly where he'd moved and stuff like that, and be able to follow the blood trail. So we did so. We found the broken arrow, retrieved the broadhead, all that type of stuff. But interestingly, as we were going along, and I'd actually just put my binoculars up because I was like, I should be able to see him pretty soon. And I scanned into where these paper barks were and where the blood trail was sort of leading. And just as I'd seen his horn, like laying down, he was definitely deceased and had passed away and everything like that pretty quickly after a good lung shot. James and I looked at each other because we kept hearing this noise over the last probably minute or two. And interestingly, just as we'd seen this buffalo horn and confirmed that this bull was down 30 meters in front of us in this paperbark swamp, just beyond him, sort of where we were heading, we could hear these boars fighting. So that was pretty amazing to shoot this buffalo bull, have pigs and other water buffalo around us. And then just as we thought, we'd had this amazing hunt, this next element of the hunt sort of emerges with these two potential, boars fighting over an in-season sow, which was pretty cool. So I will get into that here in a second, and we can continue on with the hunt story. Bringing target precision to hunting camp, Option Archery makes specialist gear. Their quiverizer is one of our favourite bits of kit. This stabilizer combined arrow quiver is extremely unique, cutting weight with its clever 2-in-1 design. The Option sights are versatile in this regard also, offering both a single or multi-pin sight housing within the same sight. Shop their products today. So these squeals that we were hearing, I think, like in being able to revise the situation now that we've come out of it and on the other side of the hunt, obviously, I think a lot of the squeals were actually younger pigs fighting. And often, as you get with any rutting, mob or animals and things like that, even with deer, you'll have the mature stags, on the estrus hind. And in this example, I think there was a in-season sow, and we probably had these two mature boars, and then maybe, anywhere from 5 to 10 younger sort of satellite boars that were also doing a bit of fighting and rutting. And these were the ones that were really vocal. And they're the ones that were really, every minute or 2 minutes or something like that, one of those would obviously get beaten up in a fight and they would squeal and let out this really, big sort of as if something was getting stabbed or murdered or something, like this really high pitched squeal. And that was what we were hearing a bit more evidently. But the whole time, and honestly, all of this was transpiring, no more than probably 100 meters away from where this big buffalo bull had sort of hit the ground. So we didn't actually have very far to sort of navigate through all this like paperbark swamp. And so where the buffalo fell was pretty much all dry, like paperbark swamp. And where we were heading towards the sound of these boars fighting, or basically the action of where all these animals were moving and the pigs were squealing, it just kept getting deeper and deeper, and a couple of inches of water at a time. We were basically starting to hunt through this submerged sort of paperbark swamp. And as we got closer to the main rutting action, very quickly we started identifying lots of younger pigs and a lot of younger boars between that sort of 40 and 60 kilo mark. And they were basically just orbiting where these two mature boars were actually fighting over the sow. And we would basically just catch glimpses of movement in the shadows, essentially, because it was getting darker into the afternoon and the sun was sort of beginning to set. So with so many vertical trees and all these paperbarks sort of lined up, it was actually difficult to see past probably 20 odd meters, I'd say, is sort of the window that we had. So the only real, I guess, way that we tailed this mob and were able to find this mob was because of these high-pitched squeals that would sort of let us know roughly where they were. And then they would it'd be like a pig squeal, and then it would sort of stop and be quiet. But as we got closer, probably within about 50 meters, we could eventually hear these low-pitched sort of growls and grunts. And these are more characteristic of sort of when there are two equal-sized, more mature boars fighting. And often that's when they're like lined up, posturing and sizing each other up, and they're actually locked into fighting and head tossing and trying to basically stab each other with their tusks and hitting each other's fighting pads and stuff. You hear this really low pitch. It's almost like a chuckle sort of grunt. And basically we're able to use that to sort of lock in on exactly where these two boars that we wanted to actually get a look at were fighting. We sort of started ignoring like where the actual squeals were coming from, because as we got closer, we were pushing young pigs off just because we had to physically get close enough to these mature boars. And as we got to about 25 meters, I had an arrow on the string. Again, assessing everything pretty close range, because that's just where our view sort of was. We saw this black boar and a ginger and black boar, and they were basically, as we'd anticipated, grunting and chuckling next to each other, but right next to each other, doing a heap of salivating. There was a sow in the mix there. And as we got closer, I think they sort of identified that, they were being watched. And as this ginger and black boar, the one that sort of, to be honest, I didn't get a great look at either boar. I just knew that they were both going to be sort of big and mature based on the way that they were fighting. He sort of broke off from the other boar and sort of headed towards our right. And, with all this commotion, I just drew back the bow instinctively. And as he started walking off, probably to flee the scene, just because we were sub 20 meters at this point, both James and I sort of pulled him up with a bit of a grunt or an oi, whatever you want to call it. You'll be able to see and hear all this in the video footage of the honey hole on YouTube. But it was all pretty rushed. And as I said, this boar was walking away to sort of get away. And I was just trailing him with the arrow at full draw and the sight sort of where I wanted to shoot. And as soon as he pulled up, I maybe took a second to try and stabilize and squeezed off the shot. And to be honest, my initial thoughts was that I thought the arrow hit him perfectly. I thought I saw it hit him through like the point of the shoulder. But at the same time, I remember thinking that I'd saw like a tree or something shake or fall, or that's sort of all I really like gathered in terms of information after the shot. The pig sort of ran off really, really quickly, pretty much straight away from us. I heard crashing and water splashing for about 40 meters, and then it just went quiet. Like I didn't hear anything after that. I heard a few other pigs moving sort of around us and that, like not knowing exactly what had gone on. But I turned around to James and said, like, did you get that on film? And he was like, yep, got it. And we kind of watched it back and rewatched the footage. And on reflection, it was hard kind of trying to view it because it was quite quickly this little saga played out. But very quickly you could see that in the footage, my arrow, in the tracking this boar and looking through the sight, I'd sort of missed that there was a branch right in front of me that the arrow actually travels through and cuts a sapling basically straight in half. And I think this is where having a really good bomb-proof setup comes into play. And we were using a really good carbon micro diameter sort of shaft and these Kyoga Broadheads, a nice solid 2-blade. And even though it hit this sapling, which was probably about as thick as my pinky finger, and cut it in half, just below where sort of the leaves and everything sprout off the stem of this tree or branch, the arrow still had enough, consistency and strength and whatnot and trajectory to punch forward. And it did end up hitting this boar sweetly through the point of the shoulder. And it was interesting because we went and found that arrow, it had completely passed through that boar even after the slight deflection. Where we got a little bit, stumbled was that there was no blood on the arrow whatsoever. And maybe part of that was because we had to retrieve it from, the water. When it had passed through the boar and had gone the other edge of this paperbark swamp, it was sort of like in the water and the mud. So maybe that's why. But anyway, it was a little bit peculiar. And I was kind of like, geez, maybe I actually missed him. Maybe the arrow deflected and shot hit the branch and deflected down, and it looked like it hit the pig, but it actually went under him. And anyway, we were trying to piece it all together and just doing our due diligence. We were like, well, we know which way he took off. We'll just try and track him. And we ended up tracking him, and we'd only gone 20 meters, and we found the first drop of blood. And I was like, oh, we did hit him. Like, if I hit him where I thought the arrow hit him, he should be dead here in a second. And we literally took maybe 10 more steps and found him probably 40 meters away from where we'd seen him from where we'd shot him and where we'd last seen him. And that's exactly where it expired. And mid-stride had come to a bit of a halt in that paperbark swamp. So that was just a bit of extra sort of, cream on top in this scenario. We'd shot the buffalo literally minutes earlier, and then less than 100 meters away shot this really nice ginger and black boar that was fighting with another sort of equal boar. But the whole theme of the trip was just a real fast-paced hunt, trying to put as much action and, adventure into this little hunt in between work as much as possible. And to get this buffalo and boar in the same afternoon on a property that we've never hunted before was really rewarding, really satisfying. And I think, the way that we've edited this hunt to play out on YouTube is sort of reflective of that. So, we ended up dragging this boar over to the buffalo just because it was probably a bit easier to drag, a 90 kilo boar to the buffalo rather than the other way around. But yeah, it capped off an incredible day in the Northern Territory. And for anyone that wants to go and visit, that hunt and see what I'm talking about here, please feel free to jump over to our YouTube, Twin Elements on YouTube, and check out the Honey Hole. It's actually part 1 of a 6-part Northern Territory adventure that James and I go and do. And yeah, we think it's a really great hunt. As you can hear, we shoot a really nice buffalo bull. But I think part of what makes this film really, really enjoyable is that, there's some footage of crocodiles, some footage of, different birds, whether it's brolgas, jabberoos, the scenery. Some of the drone footage is really pretty and spectacular. And that's just what, I guess, I was chasing when I moved to the Northern Territory a couple of years ago. And what's going to continually take me back to the Northern Territory is just how remote it is, and then the amazing abundance of wildlife and spectacular scenery.
If you're sick of having dull knives in the kitchen or whilst out fishing or hunting, then check out the Kimbo Rolling Knife Sharpener. Its easy design means anyone can have knives razor sharp in minutes. Australian owned and backed by a 90-day money-back guarantee, it's a perfect gift for anyone that loves cooking or in the outdoor space. Use code TWINELEMENTS15 to get 15% off your next order.
Well, that was really fun to sort of relive in the action and adventure of that hunt. As I said, go and check out the honey hole. But for those of you that love the FAQ segment, today we're going to answer a few questions from listeners that have sent them in. So please continue to do so. If you want to email them into info@twinelements.com.au, or either DM James Doumtsis Outdoors, Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors, or Twin Elements on Instagram. Both James and I will strive to answer those questions there. And then obviously if they're worthy and we feel like they benefit other people, we'll try and answer them on future episodes of the podcast. So this week's question has been sent in by Scotty's Gone Walkabouts. So Scotty says, "Love your work, fellas. I'm new to hunting and have been really enjoying the potty. I've got a question for your FAQ section. What's the go with feeding wild meat such as feral pig, goat, etc. to your dog? Is it okay to give it to them raw, or should you always cook it first? I'm worried about passing on any parasites, etc. Thanks for the help, fellas." So that's a phenomenal question. Really good, really intelligent to think of the risks associated with any wild game meats, whether it's to us and what we consume, as well as to our beloved pets. So my main consideration, if it's just parasites that you're worried about, freezing most stuff for 2 weeks will kill most, cysts, tapeworms, all these sorts of things, as well as slow any, progression of bacteria replication. What I would consider if you are planning on, and that's probably more for like venison, buffalo meat. I know a lot of people, when they have roo permits, will shoot roos and things like that for dog meat. Again, roos are one of the animals that probably have the most parasites just based on eating grass very short, close to the ground. So for whatever the meat is and type of protein source, if you're not eating it and feeding it to your dogs, I would consider freezing it for a couple of weeks. From there, freezing it, if you do have a good mincer, it's actually really easy to mince par frozen meat and do into batches for your dogs or whatever. So that's one benefit. But if it comes to pork, then what I would do is freeze it for 2 weeks, as we've discussed. And then I would cook it to a minimum of 71 degrees just for your dogs. And that's purely for the risk of brucellosis or the threat of brucellosis, which is, as we discussed in one of our previous episodes, I think it was like, diseases in game meats or something like that. The threat there is that this bacteria doesn't get killed until it's cooked past that temperature. And the best way to work that out is to probably, again, freeze it, cook it as a batch of mince, cook the absolute crap out of it, and then probably refreeze that or bag it up or work it out how you can then do that for your dogs. And that's going to render it safe for, any of your dogs that you're trying to feed. And again, good on you for trying to, utilize a resource, take meat out of the bush and use it, because dogs are obviously expensive when you've got to feed them, and being able to use this lean protein sources is one way to keep them pretty happy and healthy too. So thanks very much for your question, Scotty. We appreciate it. Our next question, number 2 for today, has been sent in by Jamie, and you're going to have to give me a bit of leeway here. I hope I pronounce this correctly. Jamie Barimus. I'm going to stick with that. Anyway, Jamie says, "I'm new to bow hunting. Any recommendations on how to choose a brand of arrow to shoot? Everyone pushes a brand." So very well stated. Similarly to what Jamie has mentioned, everyone who bow hunts has their own preferences and thoughts regarding arrows. The very same can probably be said for broadheads, for types of bows, whether it's Hoyt or Matthews or whatever, whether it's, it used to be the old Australian debate between Ozcut broadheads and Kyoga. There's mechanical versus solid two-blade versus three-blade. Arrow shafts are the exact same. The great thing, I guess, at the moment for new hunters is that there are so many brands of quality arrows out there. James and I are currently running the Day 6 shafts by Day 6 Gear. What's really cool about this is that one of our favourites, Remy Warren, who many of you guys, our listeners, are probably familiar with, a hunter that's over in the United States, he is now actually an owner of this terrific brand, which is huge. So we actually, started working with Day 6 with Brian. Remy Warren has obviously now bought into that business, and the fact that he trusts and uses and now invests in, his own company, Day 6, is really, really cool for us, because he is someone that, similarly to us, I guess, and what we're always striving to do is do these amazing big hunts where you've got to rely on your gear. And the fact that he puts that brand, and backing into his own brand there, Day 6, is really, really cool. So just on Day 6, both James and I are shooting their 275 HD shafts. So that's just the spine, basically. Now that's a bit of a hybrid between, the normal 250 and 300 spine shafts. Their 275 spine shafts come in at, I think it's like 11.8 grains per inch. Don't take that as fact. I think that just rings, comes true if I had to say something. But these have been bomb-proof and super consistent for us. We've shot a heap of critters this year, including a few big red stags, some chital deer, good feral pigs, all that type of stuff. And these have been really, really good, performed really, really well. As always the case, James and I try and be super transparent and fair, especially when considering gear and equipment and all that type of stuff, because we understand that Day 6 gear is quite expensive, but again, we would rather invest in expensive gear that we're going to be able to use on some of these hunts that we consider sort of once in a lifetime or very big stakes in the game. So some other brands to consider, which are owned by Australians, would be Nick Morton makes Nexus bow hunting shafts, which we've used for a long time. We actually used them on this buffalo hunt, so you can see the proof in the pudding. Another really good Aussie brand there, the Nexus bow hunting shafts. Jabstick Outdoors are another brand. These arrows are made by Jack Spinks, who is another mad keen Australian bow hunter, very good fella. And one of the cool things about his business is that if you buy a dozen shafts, you get one shaft free, which can be a bit of a, practice or tuning shaft. And if you're buying, a few arrows, an extra free arrow here and there does add up. So that's another great offer by Jabstick Outdoors. And then lastly, another Australian brand that I'd throw out there is the Terra Firma Archery, who I've seen a heap of their stuff on Instagram and whatnot and on the socials, and they seem to be another manufacturer that are Australian owned, made, all that type of stuff. And these guys are, I know like Jules Bennick, for example, is a guy that's using their heads. There's Adam Greentree. Some of these well-known Australian bow hunters are using their gear. So it's just worth mentioning if you're, are new to the bow hunting scene and looking at getting shafts, there's some Australian-made options. And then there are some other global arrow companies that are very much tried and tested. Some of them we've actually shot ourselves over the years as we've sort of come up through the ranks of hunting. And that would be like Eastern Archery, Gold Tip Arrows, Victory Arrows, Black Eagle, just to name a few. So I think the biggest thing and main considerations when looking at arrows, or biggest factors that influence our choices in general, are always going to be cost. Is definitely something that is at the forefront, whether we want to admit it or not. I think just the optionality is really, really good, and that's where having multiple different spines comes in handy. And then just like the destruction testing, the performance and durability that the company sort of puts their arrows through before they release them on the market is really, really important. And then one thing that we won't ever go without is the insert/outsert, I guess, combination, and having like a really bomb-proof setup up front where that broadhead screws into the arrow, because some, don't even have collars, some don't have inserts, some don't have outsert sort of combinations. And I just remember in the early days of our hunting, James and I used to shoot animals, and you'd shoot them really well through the point of the shoulder, and the arrow would just snap like 2 or 3 inches back from where that insert or outsert sort of should have been. And again, a lot of this is probably coming to new hunters or new bow hunters as a heap of information and stuff that's probably not super relevant or super, like well known, or stuff that you don't know about because you haven't deep dived into it. So again, hopefully this doesn't overwhelm people. Hopefully most of you understand what we're saying about here and just give you guys a few different brands to look into. Again, we're super happy with our day 6 shafts. We've been shooting them this year, which has been really, really cool for us. But yeah, we will touch on all of this in a future podcast of the show, where we'll basically do a deep dive into arrow selection and different traits to look for when building sort of your hunting setup of choice. So thank you very much for tuning into the FAQ section. Well, this brings us to the conclusion of the show. Hopefully everyone has been enjoying our recent YouTube releases. If you've been living under a rock or haven't seen across our social media, over the past 3 weeks, we've released some amazing films from the Northern Territory with a heap of bow hunting action and adventure. So the first one kicked off on the 16th of July with The Honey Hole, which is what we've spoken about today. The next 2 films were part 1 and part 2 of our banteng and boar hunting adventure with Dingo Creek Hunting up in Australia's Coburg Peninsula. So this coming Wednesday, the 6th of August, we're actually set to release part 3 of our banteng and boar bow hunt. And it's fair to say, with literally no exaggeration whatsoever, that the next 2 boar hunting films from this trip are probably going to be the most insane boar bow hunting films that you'll ever witness. Some of the action is absolutely mental. We're talking about shooting multiple bedded boars without moving. We're talking about shooting multiple bedded boars, reusing those arrows, resharpening those broadheads just to go and shoot more boars, from these boggy, croc-infested water sources as the dry season sort of continues to heat up and the water sources diminish, and these feral pigs, which are basically living out in remote floodplains and swamps and never really get hunted, they're forced to come in from really vast areas into tiny little water sources that we sort of are finding them on bedded. And honestly, it's some of the best bow hunting action, some really cool filming and stuff like that. So we hope everyone is enjoying that Northern Territory adventure. Whilst you're over there on the YouTube channel, please make sure that you're subscribed. We have plenty more content dropping over the coming months as well. We have another, 3 Northern Territory films coming out over the next 3 weeks. So we're halfway through that adventure. We then will have 8 American USA vlogs coming out. We are destined to go over to the US next month. So we will be hopefully filming a heap more content then. And then just after that USA content comes out, we are going to be releasing 8 films, I believe it is, potentially even more, from our rut hunt from this year, where we shoot a few really nice red stags on film, some really good boars, goats, all this type of stuff. So we have nearly 20 films in the works coming out over the next little while, which we're really excited about and can't wait to share and deliver to you guys. The next thing that I want to touch on is we have some big things in store for you guys and girls as we get deeper into 2025. As of this moment, we're going to be continuing to reward you guys, our listeners, with a unique discount code for all of the prints over on the Twin Elements website. So please continue to use the code the Twin Elements Podcast for 10% off any print orders. If anyone out there listens to the podcast and just wants a written, code that we can send you guys just to confirm exactly what that is for when you go and check out at the website, just send us a message and say, hey guys, I listened to the podcast, what's the code? I'll flick that to you either through Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors, James Doumtsis Outdoors, or Twin Elements on Instagram or Facebook or wherever it may be. With over 40 prints on the website to choose from, there's literally something there for everyone. They're perfectly suited for display at home or in the office. we love seeing them on people's walls. It's something that we're really proud of. And to be honest, I want you guys to keep your eyes peeled for our second release of prints. I've been working away doing a bit more editing over the last few months. And as we sort of go about and do some more cool adventures, we've actually got some more prints to sort of expand and put up on the website shortly. So there'll be a few red deer, chital deer. What else we've got? We've got buffalo prints to come out. Hopefully some stuff from the US once we go over and do that hunt. But yeah, if anyone sees any prints or photos or anything that they want made available, we can also do custom prints and things like that. So just trying to, make it more accessible to you guys and get our work out there. We really appreciate the support, as always. We have less than 1 week to go. On the 9th and 10th of August, James and I are headed to Brisbane to catch up with the legends at Venture Hunting and Outdoors. So this is going to be in celebration of their 1 year opening anniversary. They're throwing a 2-day event at their super impressive megastore in Springwood, Brisbane on the 9th and 10th of August, as I said earlier. So if you went to the grand opening nearly a year ago, you would have seen just how epic that day was. There's going to be heaps of discounts and savings on the day, plus loads of experts moving around the store, talking about things in their respective fields to help you guys on your hunting and outdoor journey. So please come along, enjoy some food and drink, do some shopping, meet like-minded people, and be part of the ever-expanding Venture Hunting and Outdoors community. James and I hope to see you all there in the flesh and meet many of you guys that listen to this podcast. Lastly, please continue to subscribe, review, and rate the podcast. We appreciate the support that we're getting on it. And James and I are keen to keep this going. We have plenty of topics coming your way. We're going to do a few more in the coming weeks on the Northern Territory and then shift it over to a few topics regarding the USA while we're doing a few hunts in the US. So that's going to be pretty fitting. But a massive one, thank you guys for listening, and it's been good to jump back on and sort of do this. So thank you very much for all your support moving forward, and we'll catch you guys on the next episode of the podcast. Cheers, legends.